Friends and family of light, welcome back to Mind Keys. I'm super excited to get to share this video with you today. This is going to be a fun one, I think. This is going to be something a little bit different. I decided I wanted to try a new format out here with you. So if you like this, please do comment down below to let me know to make more of this kind of content for you. So the basic idea here is just a response video. I'm sure you've seen others like it. And just starting to build a conversation with other content creators and kind of chime in with my own perspectives, particularly around the psychedelic space, the personal development space, the hypnosis space, things like that. And really just offer my own experience, my own perspective as someone who works as an integration coach, works as a hypnotherapist and an NLP practitioner, who does change work, who studies the mind and the brain in psychedelic science. As someone who, myself, I've done, way more psychedelics than most people, honestly. And I've been involved in the psychedelic underground in one form or another for more than 20 years. So I'm just kind of offering my perspective. And, I'm not trying to win everyone over. I'm not trying to have, everyone like me on this. I'm just trying to give one particular perspective that adds a dimension to this conversation. So if you resonate with it, that's awesome. That's what I want. And if not, that's fine too. So let's go ahead and talk about today's content. So the content for today is this awesome podcast, this kind of return of Jordan Peterson to Tim Ferriss's podcast. And I assume that most of you watching are familiar with both of these names, that you know who they are. And I'm assuming that you're probably well aware, if you're already in the psychedelic space or interested in psychedelics, you probably know about Tim Ferriss and his recent involvement in the psychedelic space over, say, the last 5 years or so. If you don't, these are both two very smart individuals who have contributed a lot, I would say, in the last 10 years to the personal growth, personal development space in their own ways. Anyways, they had this, podcast come out about 6 weeks ago. It looks like March 1st. And it was in it, there's a really interesting little kind of bubble, little kind of take on openness, trade openness, and the relationship to psychedelics, and kind of this study that found that taking psychedelics even once increases trade openness, by a large degree. And I thought that was interesting. And I wanted to kind of offer my own vantage point on that. I want to offer my own perspective as someone who is already very high in trade openness. So as someone who's, naturally very, very open, I think I'm like the 86%, like I'm super up there. I wanted to share kind of the pros and cons, because I'm someone who has not only, taken a lot of psychedelics, but probably has a natural proclivity towards openness. So I want to share how that's impacted me, how that's affected me, so that you know more about that. If you think about it, in theory, being open is a good thing, right? Being more relaxed, being more accepting, being more appreciative, being more open-minded. These all sound like positives. These all sound like things that most people would want to experience more of. I mean, in contrast, being closed off, being rigid, being inflexible doesn't sound very comfortable or very fun or like a rewarding way to be. But I think if you scratch the surface a little bit of openness, which kind of Jordan does in this clip, you kind of see that it's not necessarily all good just to increase your openness. So I want to kind of speak to that, because people kind of don't necessarily consider what the shadow aspects or what the negative, kind of repercussions of being more open are. So if you're thinking about taking psychedelics, or you're kind of new to psychedelics and you're excited about it and you're just kind of rosy-eyed, wearing rosy glasses, and you're like, oh, I want to be more open, that's going to be great. I want to kind of just give you some food for thought on the other side of that. Now, I also want to say that Peterson takes a very skeptical kind of, approach to trade openness. And that's fair. He's, one of the world experts on personality and Big Five. I can't really talk to that. I can't really touch that, but I can share my own experience. I'm not necessarily as skeptical. I don't necessarily think it's necessarily as bad as he's making it out. And I'll kind of lay out, my own, disagreements and kind of where I think he's maybe being a little heavy-handed. But the other side of the coin there is kind of Tim Ferriss's kind of point of view in this video, where he's very optimistic. He sees it as a net positive. And there's some things I don't think Tim or people who have that kind of mindset or, view on it have necessarily considered. So that would just kind of offer my own experience being someone who's, again, highly open. So here, let's go ahead and dive into it. Okay, so in this first clip, we've got Tim kind of introducing the idea or the topic of trade openness to bounce off of Peterson, and Peterson really taking this kind of skeptical, fairly hardline kind of tack off the bat here with the conversation. And I find it really interesting, and so I want to just play this for you and then kind of share with you my thoughts on what Peterson has to say.
You've spoken in the videos I've seen, at least, of the changes in openness.
Yes, they're pronounced.
Would that not be a positive thing if that is a consequence of opening Pandora's box?
Depends on how neurotic you are. No, I mean it technically. This is the technical discussion.
Okay, so I'm going to stop there. So this is interesting. So Peterson's point is that openness plus neuroticism is a problem. And I agree with that. I think that's true. As someone who also deals with a fair amount of neuroticism or dealt with a fair amount of neuroticism, I know that to be the case personally. And with that being said, what's interesting here is that he's really operating under the assumption or the presupposition, if you will, that psychedelics only affect trade openness and have no impact on neuroticism. But what's interesting about that is if you look at all, you just go anecdotally with, what you see on Reddit, with all the different kind of psychedelic subreddits or various forums, invariably what you find is a lot of people finding a decrease in their neurotic symptoms, whether that's less anxiety, whether that's less social anxiety, whether that's less depression, whether that's less pessimism, whether that's, some change for the better in terms of decreasing neuroticism and increasing positive emotion. Also worth noting, there's some science that I just saw. I wish I could had the link. Maybe I'll post it below if I dig it up. Where apparently they have done studies recently on trait neuroticism and psychedelic use and found that it does indeed decrease neuroticism. So sure, neuroticism increasing with a static sense, not neuroticism, openness increasing with a static sense of neuroticism, sure, I totally get how that's a bad thing. But if it's increasing openness and decreasing neuroticism, which it seems to be doing based on what we can tell from the current science, maybe it's not as terrible as we think. So food for thought on that anyways. Okay, so in this next clip, we have them talking a bit more about just defining what openness is. And I'll stop it at the end because I do think there's something like a little detail here I want to point out that I think is really relevant, really interesting for anyone who's ever done psychedelics. So let's check it out.
Niche. They're on the edge.
Jordan, would you mind defining openness in this particular context?
Sure. Well, people who are open, there's creativity, essentially. Creativity and verbal fluency together make up openness. Now, it's also associated with verbal IQ.
So I find that really interesting, that it's associated with creativity. Sure, that makes sense. But also with verbal fluency and verbal IQ. Here's why I find that interesting. For most people who've ever taken a psychedelic, whether it's your first time or your second or third, sometime early on, most of us discover kind of this sense of words being ridiculous or silly or comical or kind of fluid. And we find ourselves able to kind of make jokes and puns and crack word jokes and get really silly and kind of strange with words and language. It becomes this tool that all of a sudden is suddenly so clear how limited it is, how kind of strange and bizarre it is to use our faces to make noises that are symbols for meanings that we all kind of collectively kind of vaguely understand together. And the strangeness, the bizarreness of language itself really gets highlighted on a psychedelic experience. So I think it's interesting that as it increases openness, part of what's happening there is it's increasing verbal fluency and verbal IQ. So I don't know, found that fascinating. Okay, so this next clip really gets to the kind of the meat, the crux of the conversation here. And there's really something that I want to share with you about this as we get into it more. Yeah, I thought I would just go ahead and play this first. And this is really what maybe some of the issues or challenges are that come along with being high in trait openness. And again, as someone who tests at the 86th percentile or higher, give or take, in openness, who generally I find to be amongst my peers one of the most open people most of the time, this is something I can speak to directly. So I thought I would share this with you, and then we could kind of go from there.
And, you might think the more of that, the better, but no, that isn't how nature works. So, you can undo yourself by being open. People who are open have a hard time catalyzing their identity because they're so protean. They shift shapes constantly. They're interested in everything. It makes it very hard for them to pursue one thing.
So I'm going to stop there because I think that kind of gets to the heart of it. So I would say in my own experience, this has been true for me. And it's a plus and a minus. The minus obviously is, sure, you can be easily distracted. You can kind of end up chasing every shiny thing around you or in front of you. You can be curious about things that are irrelevant or don't matter. You can end up, wanting to know things that end up being a huge waste of time. But the other side of that coin is that you can also become a kind of jack of all trades, where you are learned in a lot of different things, or you become skillful in a lot of things to a certain degree, to a certain level, as far as that amount of time will allow you to kind of achieve. Or you can end up just generally becoming familiar and fluent with more aspects of life. You become more of kind of, an autodidact. I think, generally open people tend to be self-educated, and you kind of become, a little bit of a polymath, not really in the sense that you're not necessarily an expert. But I bet you, if you look at every polymath out there, they're probably high in openness. Because how do you take the skills from one area of life, from one domain, and transfer those to another area, unless you have a natural kind of broadness of interests, right? So openness can be a benefit if it's used well. In my own experience, kind of some of the negatives that people don't really consider about trait openness or don't think about as being problematic is that it can actually contribute to anxiety and depression. And here's how. So if you're high in openness, you're going to be interested in everything, right? You're going to be curious. You're going to want to learn. You're going to spend time absorbed in all kinds of different areas of life, wanting to really take in and understand and learn. And in general, that's a good thing. But also what that can mean is that you end up failing more because you're not going deep enough in any one thing, because you're giving up too quickly, because you're not following through enough to become an expert or to develop that high level competence that enables you to really succeed. So what I found a lot with people who are open is that, and this is true for me, this is also true for others I know like me, is that we can end up being so fascinated that we kind of spread ourselves too thin, don't go deep enough, and then we fail a lot because of that. We're constantly flitting from thing to thing to thing, and therefore never really getting traction, never really succeeding. And because of that, when you fail enough times, it can start to become a narrative that you feed back into yourself. It can become a self-criticism piece, or it can become the kind of thing that the more you fail, the more you start to feel bad about yourself and let it affect your self-esteem. And then that becomes anxiety. You become worried you're going to fail again, or you're not going to follow through again, or you're going to get distracted again. And the more that starts to build up, that becomes anxiety. And once that anxiety really accumulates and you can't seem to unstick yourself from that problem, kind of unenmesh yourself from having this habit of being curious about everything, that can turn to depression eventually, where you just feel kind of hopeless and you feel stuck with being curious about everything, knowing a lot of shit, but at the end of the day, not really being competent in any one thing. So this has been my experience. This is also the experience for a lot of artists I know. They end up trying a lot of different things that don't work. They kind of flip from project to project, from idea to idea, and generally struggle to kind of really dig in long enough for something to really hit. And so that can be a huge kind of unforeseen shadow aspect or negative aspect to being too open. There are other problems with it too. I've noticed that generally speaking, in any social interaction, I'm amongst the most open people there. And I don't mean that as to brag or say that I'm better or anything like that. Just that's how it's been. I'm generally the most open-minded person amongst a room of people, or amongst the top 2 or 3 most open-minded people. And while I really love that about myself, I really value that. I think it's fun. I think it's interesting. And other people do too. It allows me to be really socially adaptable. It allows me to have interesting things to say to a wider variety of people. The downside is that when people realize that you are open-minded in areas where they're kind of ideological, or where they're kind of hung up on something, or where they have a hardline opinion, they will take it personal. At very least, they'll see you as a fence sitter. They'll see you as somebody who's unwilling to kind of, put your chips on the table and lay into what you really believe, proclaim your values. It really triggers this kind of weird tribal filtering, fear, higher, lower, better than, worse than, in-group, out-group kind of thing with people pretty quickly. So I've had to be conscious of that, and be conscious how open I show myself to be to people, because sometimes people have a boundary where something isn't acceptable, and I will be maybe not necessarily open-minded beyond their boundary in terms of just being like, oh, that's totally acceptable, but being able to hold multiple perspectives around a given issue and see it from different points of view, and hold all of them equally and see the validity of these multiple vantage points. So while that sounds great, while I think we all want to be more mentally flexible in general and able to empathize more clearly and cleanly with the world around us and understand life from multiple points of view, because that gives us a sense of peace and a sense of well-being, the other side of the coin that I find is that if you're interacting with someone who's triggered about something, that's actually a downside. It becomes something that can kind of separate you two and filter you out, and people end up judging you and not liking you about it. So that's another issue. If you become more open, the more open you become, the more you kind of, single yourself out, I guess you could say, in terms of kind of tribalism and tribal politics, if you will. Okay, so next here we have this clip where Jordan is talking about, beware of unearned wisdom, his favorite kind of quote from Carl Jung. So I'm going to play that really quick just to kind of familiarize you in case you're not familiar with Jordan Peterson, you haven't heard his kind of riff about Carl Jung and beware unearned wisdom. And then I'm going to share my own kind of perspective on this. And, who am I to, disagree with Jordan Peterson or Carl Jung for that matter. But at the same time, I do have my own thought on it, and I want to share that as well. So let's watch.
But what, the psilocybin, you take one dose and have a mystical experience, and you move from 50th percentile openness to 85th percentile with one dose. It's a major neurological rewiring. It's stunning. It's stunning. And you could say, well, that I'm sure there are things about that are good. But Jung said, beware of unearned wisdom.
Okay, so if you guys haven't heard his riff on this before, I'm sure there's got to be hundreds of YouTube videos on that particular point. But I wanted to just speak to that really quick, because I actually think that there's some flawed thinking in that quote. So beware of unearned wisdom is the quote, at least according to Peterson. He could be misquoting. But if you think about it, what he probably means is beware of unearned knowledge. There's a difference there. When knowledge becomes integrated and practiced, that's when it becomes wisdom, right? So in theory, if you have unearned wisdom, it's not wisdom, it's knowledge. So beware of unearned knowledge. Sure, unearned knowledge, if you know something that you have been shown but haven't lived and embodied and tested to be true, sure, that can be dangerous. I mean, we see that all the time on the internet with meme culture and kind of the contagion of viral ideas that aren't really generated from inside the person, but they're kind of consumed from the outside in, and therefore they're not really deeply digested and integrated into the person. But when it is integrated, when an idea is digested, or when it is generated from raw personal experience and turned outward from something that's unconscious into a conscious knowing, then that's to me what wisdom is. And I would say, as long as it's actual wisdom, that means it's embodied, it's, lived, it's known in the body. And at that point, you don't need to be frightened of it. You don't need to be worried about it. So this quote, I think, is a little dicey. Sure, I get it. You can end up in the deep end of the psyche. And I think that's really what Jung's point there is, to be careful to, with what you explore, because you can end up in the deep end of the psyche. And if you don't have really kind of the correct mental model or maps or tools to kind of contextualize what it is that you've learned, you can end up just totally overwhelmed or confused. And, this is what psychedelic integration work is. So much of the time when I'm helping people, I'm helping them to either generate a broader map that incorporates what they've experienced, or I'm helping them take something that's been unconsciously learned and bring it into the conscious, and then help them kind of understand how to live life carrying that knowledge and that wisdom. That's basically what integration work is. So, yeah, I get it. I mean, there's definitely a place to be cautious of what you know, but I think Peterson is a little kind of heavy-handed, a little free with this particular, quote, and I don't think the quote's quite accurate. I don't think Jung's quite on the head with this. I think what he means is beware of unearned knowledge, because once it becomes wisdom, it's useful, it's practical. Okay, so in this next clip here, Peterson starts to talk about how he kind of says in the conversation here that he thinks the world is much more mysterious and deeply strange than most people understand or realize or believe. And Tim kind of presses him on it and asks him to kind of elucidate and kind of expand upon that idea. And that's what he does here for us. I think it's so true. Anyone who's ever taken psychedelics gets that pretty quickly. And I think it's pretty self-evident. And I have a couple points I want to make about that. So I thought I would just play that for you really quick. Let me make sure that I've got that, the timing right on that. And then we'll go from there.
Experience.
True.
Yeah.
True.
I
Absolutely.
think,
I mean, if you have ego dissolution, that can do something for fear of death.
Oh yeah. I also think that's phenomenal research. It's unbelievably interesting. And it's certainly the case that, like, I firmly believe that the world is not the way we perceive it. It's deeply strange. And I do believe that the hallucinogens reveal that.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, I agree. I think anyone who's ever done a significant dose of a psychedelic would have to agree with that statement. And I think it's really interesting to consider that. So, okay, I'm speaking to another common issue I see for people when it comes to integration. And that is kind of how to integrate, knowing that this material, 3D, normal physical world is like this. And then you take a psychedelic and all of a sudden you're having this whole experience of an alternate dimensional reality that is so much more vivid and rich and seems so much more real. And it's really kind of confusing for a lot of people, and they have a hard time understanding how to bridge those worlds together in their own kind of understanding. And so I wanted to just kind of speak to this really quick. Part of what's interesting about this is that what psychedelics do from a neuroscience perspective, from a brain perspective, more than anything else, is really shut off, the DMN, the default mode network. And really, it's instead of increasing brain activity, what psychedelics do is decrease brain activity. And the effect you get from decreased brain activity is this sense of heightened perception of more information coming through the filter into your conscious awareness, and really experiencing the world in a much more vivid, vibrant, multifaceted way. So I think that, what there is to understand here is not so much that there's the one world and then the other world, and that it's some sort of kind of binary reality. I think it's more important to understand that there's a whole spectrum of this reality, of different sets and levels and finenesses of information there for all of us. But generally, when our brain is working in the normal way that's supposed to, much of what it's doing is filtering out most of that information. So in general, that's a good thing in terms of survival, in terms of functioning materially, in terms of, making sure you get fed, making sure you're protected, that kind of a thing. In general, that's a good thing. But, when it comes to our happiness, to our mental well-being, to our spiritual well-being, that sense of filtration can be almost too narrow. It can be like a camera lens or like an aperture that's too focused and doesn't allow for a broader scope of information that exists in reality to really come into our attention and into our awareness. So I think that's much more what's going on when we're looking at psychedelics. What they do is allow us to see this kind of continuum, to see this kind of, this stratification of information that's always available to us that we're typically filtering out. So I just want to kind of offer that to you really quick. And I think that accounts for, the strangeness of the world. It's not, is the world strange or not? I think the answer is yes. It's just how much of that are we allowing in through the filter? Okay, and our last clip for today is a little bit of a divergence here. We're kind of going off into the weeds of philosophy and opinions and conjecture a little bit more. It's not necessarily on topic with trait openness, but I still think it's worth kind of just talking about, exploring for a moment, because I think it's relevant to this conversation of psychedelics, which are in this weird place between science and the science that we know about the brain and the kind of mystical, the kind of highly subjective, the intuitive, which has been a huge part of what the psychedelic community has been for, a long time, like really for time immemorial, but especially obviously since the 60s. So I wanted to just kind of bring up this point and then kind of share a little bit about it, my own opinion, a little bit of a spicy take on it, but still worth saying. So let's check it out.
I have to ask before we go to Viktor Frankl, if you're able to put words to it, in what ways do you think reality is deeply strange? Can you elaborate on that in any way?
There's a narrative aspect to it. There's a religious aspect to it. There's a meaningful aspect to it that we don't understand. We can't understand it scientifically, or we haven't been able to. The scientific viewpoint excludes that to some degree. And I think the best evidence for that probably does come from hallucinogenic experience.
Okay, so I appreciate that he's saying that. I think that that's honest. I think that that's really truthful. It's also really interesting because you would think that something as simple as the narrative arc of life, right? The experiential narrative thing would be something that would be kind of within the bounds of scientific consensus as being real, as existing, as being, a truthful, valid thing. So because, we all know that we all know what it is to live our own story. We all know that there's a story being lived out there in the world. None of that is news really to anybody. So that's still something that is unproven scientifically is kind of interesting. And I think that really hints at something much deeper that doesn't get talked about a lot, which is that it's actually very hard to quantify, the subjective. And this is one of the major issues with science, especially the sciences that have to do with anything subjective, is that we can measure, brain chemistry, we can measure body changes, we can measure, muscle changes, we can measure physiological responses, we can measure things like that. But what we can't measure are meaning. What we can't measure is subjective, quantitative, qualitative kind of understandings of life. And, so much of the psychedelic experience is subjective, ultimately. I mean, we're taking in some sort of a chemical into our bodies that alters our perception, right? So right there, you're shifting perception, which is a subjective thing. And that altering of perception then causes a whole cascade of new insights, new emotions, new experiences, new associations, new ways of perceiving old experiences or old familiar things in the world. It's, really deep what happens, and science has no way of quantifying that. And, for me, this is one of the interesting things about, kind of coaching in the psychedelic space, therapy in the psychedelic space, not to be too negative or too poo-poo on any of that, but, this is one of the reasons I love hypnosis and hypnotherapy, is that it deals directly with a person's subjective experience and doesn't make any pretense of being objective. So we know as hypnotherapists, as NLP practitioners, we know we're dealing squarely with the experience in the world of the personal subjective and the structure of a personal subjective experience. And we're cool with that. We're comfortable with that. We know that that's what's going on. That's the container inside which the entire conversation and set of experiences are happening. And if you really think about it, there's no experience you've ever had that was outside of the filtration, the filters of your own perceptions. There's no experience you've ever had, not even a psychedelic hyperspace experience, that didn't involve some form of the five senses, either externally or internally. I mean, you can hear sounds inside your head. You can see images inside your head, obviously. But even then, it's still your visual system or your auditory system or your body's sensory system in some form, rendering what is basically, abstract, sensory input in the form of electrons and electric data from life being filtered through the senses into a meaning-making kind of funnel down into your brain, right? So this is something I think is really important to bring up. We don't have a great way to quantify subjective experience. We don't have a great way to kind of really cleanly explain everything that happens inside of a scientific paradigm where we're quantifying and where we can test and, reliably control against things when it comes to the subjective. But that doesn't mean that we can't work with subjective information to improve a person's experience of life, to create change, to create transformation, to create some new output from the person that is different than what was happening before. So I just want to kind of leave that out there for you because, it's easy for, I think, people in our culture to be caught up in this overly materialistic, scientific, rationalistic kind of, paradigm, point of view and perspective, which I also incorporate and use and honor and acknowledge and appreciate. But again, going back to trade openness, I'm not simply stuck inside that one paradigm. I'm also thinking far beyond it and comfortable with that. And I would suggest that if you're really into peering into the mysteries of the psychedelic, if you're really into looking deep into it, that at some point that becomes a useful kind of way to perceive, to embrace subjectivity, to move beyond trying to rationally, logically, materialistically explain the entire experience. Yes, you can use that as a map and as a model, but it doesn't sum up everything. It doesn't sum up all of what's going on. And so, yeah, I just want to leave that thought for you there. And I think that'll kind of wrap up the video here for you. So hopefully you enjoyed this. Hopefully it wasn't too long. I'm trying to make slightly shorter, more concise videos for you. And if you like this kind of content, if you enjoy this conversation with the internet that I just had with you, with Dr. Peterson, with Tim Ferriss, please, let me know below, either by giving a thumbs up, subbing to the channel, leaving a comment. And that way I'm happy to do, you can even link me videos of stuff that you think would be interesting for me to comment on. Let me know what you think of this, because if you like it, I'm happy to make more of this kind of content. Anyways, I hope you're all well. Hope you had a great week and that you have a beautiful weekend. And I look forward to sharing more with you. And till then, big love.